All right, we're going to get started with our final panel of the day, everyone. I know it's late on a Friday afternoon. I appreciate everybody sticking around. I'm excited about this final panel, which is going to focus on policy needs and also to a certain extent on advocacy and some of the efforts that have been going on both in Sacramento and at the local level to promote zero-emission vehicle technology, implementation, and deployment. And we have a great panel for this. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read everybody's biography because you have that in the program. And if you don't have a program, there's more outside that have people's full biographies. But very quickly, I'll introduce each of the panelists. So we have Adrian Martinez, who is an attorney with Earthjustice here in Los Angeles. Adrian has worked in air quality law and environmental justice law for many years now. He used to work at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and he's been working on behalf of various advocacy groups pushing for zero-emission vehicle technology as well as for air quality improvements in Southern California. We have Laura Cortez, who is an organizer for East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. She has been working for frontline communities in the southeast part of Los Angeles County for many years now, and has been involved in various types of advocacy related to the 710 transportation corridor, as well as on behalf of port-adjacent communities in Long Beach and in Wilmington. Then we have Veronica Eady. Veronica is the Assistant Executive Officer of the Air Resources Board for Environmental Justice. So we heard at the beginning of the day from Mary Nichols, and Veronica is one of the key staff people on her team working at the state level to ensure that environmental justice makes its way into the Air Resources Board's work. She's been working particularly on implementation of AB 617, which is a law passed last year, which is going to hopefully improve air quality outcomes in local communities throughout California. But she's been engaged also in work throughout the Air Resources Board's work on climate change and air quality. And then finally we have Katie Sloan. And Katie, oh my gosh, do I not have your precise title here? I don't think I do in front of me. Well, it's on there. So Principal Manager for Innovation, Development, and Controls Customer Service for Southern California Edison. As many in this room know, Southern California Edison has been working to promote the infrastructure to deploy zero-emission vehicle technology. Over the last couple of years, Southern California Edison has really become a key player in Southern California on vehicle electrification efforts in particular. And so each of our panelists brings some great knowledge and experience to the panel. So our format's going to be a little bit different than the other panels today. We're not going to have any PowerPoint presentations. We figured for the last panel of the day it would be better to have it be more conversational. And so I'm going to just ask questions to the panelists, and we're going to have a conversation about the policy needs and advocacy strategies that are being employed right now and that we see in the near future on these issues. And then we'll open it up at a certain point for questions and answers and discussion with all of you as well. So I'll start with Adrian. So I guess I'll start by asking you your view on what the primary policy challenges are to developing and deploying zero-emission freight. So we've heard a lot today about everything from fueling infrastructure to incentives to build and deploy to technological barriers to financing. So I'm curious how you see the landscape of policy needs and also what types of incentives and regulatory tools we can use to overcome those.
Well, great. I'll start just slightly off topic, just mentioning that it's kind of jarring to have a member of the South Coast Air Quality Management District use an analogy of prison when talking about the zero emissions versus near zero debate. I have a lot of questions. Are Todd and I going to be in jail? Will George be there? Is Evan going to be there? How's this going to work? But I think Joe's presentation raises a lot of important issues and ways to think about it. A lot of this discussion about competing technologies, I think it's an important debate to have. We love that debate. We have it very publicly. But I think at the core, one of the things that we're trying to really center our agencies around is regulatory action, and regulatory action as a way to compel technological innovation. And there are a couple kind of key issues on the horizon that I see that are going to be important. One is the indirect source rule development that the South Coast Air Quality Management District is going to do. That's going to compel a large amount of facilities to start thinking about their emissions, start thinking about what technologies can they use to drive down emissions. I think it's important to understand that there's also going to be a rail yard indirect source rule explored. They were mentioned earlier. I think there's a lot of desire to get them to clean up. And then I think at the ARB, the Air Resources Board level, there's a lot of important regulations. We're going to see the first wave of what we're calling zero-emission regulations for large vehicles. A bus regulation, last mile delivery truck regulation. We're spending a lot of time and effort pushing those. We often spend a lot of time and effort trying to articulate that the incentive discussion is important, but it can distract from those efforts to get regulations over the finish line. Increasingly, we're getting drug into incentive discussions. VW, Carl Moyer, AB 617, and we're participating in those. But to be candid, I'd much rather spend my time focusing on getting good regulations that are pushing towards a zero emissions future. On the incentive piece, I think we may get the money or we may not. But ultimately, I think you heard from Chair Nichols, the goal is zero emissions future. And I'd add to you powered by, clean energy. So I think often the regulatory discussion is a talk about feasibility. Oh, this isn't feasible. You can't do it. At the end of the day, those are political calculations. Now, you may say, Adrian, you're crazy. We can't do it in this time frame, or we can't get this, technology implemented. But at the same time, we're talking about raising hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars for an industry. They're both equally crazy at the end of the day. And it's just the debate about who pays. My guess is it's going to be some combination of entities. And then the final thing is, I think we've really got to keep our utilities marching forward on this. You have air quality benefits, but there's just a lot of benefits of moving to electrification of vehicles for our grid, integration of renewables. I think it's kind of an issue we're starting to just really understand that this could be a real game changer and making California more resilient and cleaner. So I think those are kind of the infrastructure, and then also let's get some of these regulations done.
Great. And can you talk a little bit, so there was some mention earlier in the day about the California Public Utilities Commission's decision last week. I guess probably one of you, and since I've already have you on tap, maybe you can just cover the very basics of what they decided, and then maybe I'll ask Katie to expand on it a little bit because it affects Southern California Edison.
Yeah, so the California legislature, Jimmy mentioned this, passed Senate Bill 350, that had a provision on widespread transportation electrification. The commission engaged in a 2+ year process to set the parameters for the utilities, the investor-owned utilities like Edison, PG&E, and SDG&E to apply for permission to do projects. The different applications were widely different, and they were set up in 2 phases. The first phase was a priority project, priority review projects that needed to be done within 1 year, and they were capped at $20 million total per utility. We saw a wide range of different types of projects. The Port of Long Beach had 2 projects. There were school bus projects. There were passenger vehicle projects. And then there were standard review projects, which are longer in scope. They need to be done within 5 years, and there wasn't a specific budget attached to it. And so the utilities, what's I think an interesting component of it is Edison, Southern California Edison, their project or their initial application was approximately $500 million proposal for medium and heavy duty. Ultimately, it got lowered through the process, but it's really going to be focused on the freight sector. And one of the parts that was mentioned is a quarter of it is reserved for ports. That was said earlier, but I want to just clarify. A quarter of that, of the $350 million, is reserved for ports and warehouses. So there's going to be some debate as like, do ports get 12.5%, 14, all of it, or so that's an overview. And the PUC recently approved it with a rather lengthy opinion. We think it was a very well thought out approach. It focuses on deploying resources to benefit disadvantaged communities. It focuses on certain sectors like transit buses, but also ports, warehouses, those types of things. Thank you.
Now I'll go to you, Katie. So how do you see us as getting from what we could think of now as the pilot phase, I suppose, to a scale to meet our 2030 greenhouse gas transportation sector reduction goals, and how do you see the role of utilities in particular in that? And I'm curious both how what we've just heard about fits into that, and also sort of more generally how you see Edison fitting into that type of strategy.
Great, thank you. Appreciate the question. So taking a step back, Edison took a pretty lengthy process to look at how can the state meet its 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas reduction targets. And last year we put forward a clean power and electrification pathway. And we think that that really is the best way for the state to help meet those goals. Transportation makes up nearly 50% of greenhouse gas in the state of California. So without cleaning that sector, we just won't meet the targets that we need to meet. So we really see as the utility providing clean energy and being able to leverage that clean energy to electrify both vehicles and buildings. When we say clean energy today, we're at about 32% renewable energy in our portfolio. We want to get to 80% carbon-free emissions by 2030. Then we'll be able to use that clean energy to electrify vehicles. We want to get to 7 million electric vehicles on the road in California by 2030. Today, we're almost at 400,000. That's a huge increase in just 12 years. So we're really, really bullish on transportation electrification. When we put together our application that was mentioned, one of the things that we did before we decided on a strategy, because the commission made it really open-ended. They just said, put forward your ideas on transportation electrification. So there were a lot of different things we could do. And we did a lot of stakeholder engagement, talking to allies like Earthjustice and East Yards. And the biggest thing that we heard was that we really needed to focus not just on greenhouse gas emission reductions, but also cleaning the air in Southern California, which has the worst air quality in the nation. So that's why we really focused on the medium and heavy duty sector. It was from getting those learnings from talking to folks. And so we're really excited about the Public Utilities Commission's decision. We see ourselves as a utility as providing that clean fuel and putting in the infrastructure to help get over a lot of the barriers that we see in adoption for electric vehicles. So range anxiety, not having the infrastructure there, we really think that we can help provide that. I think it was a great decision from the PUC that they said, okay, we'll go ahead and approve a 5-year program as opposed to continuing to do pilots. There were definitely parties that said what we were asking for was too large, too aggressive, but I appreciate that the commission said, no, we're going to go forth, we're going to do a 5-year program, because if we're looking at 2030, that's only really 12 years away, and every vehicle that we put on the road that isn't a zero-emission vehicle is just cutting against ourselves cleaning the air and getting to those GHG targets. So at Southern California Edison, we have a program doing passenger vehicle infrastructure electrification, and just 2 weeks ago we celebrated putting in our port number 1000. It was at El Monte School District, so we've put in over 1,000 ports at fleets, workplaces, long dwell locations, and we are just looking to continue on, and we need to do that at a mass scale. This decision adopted 870 sites and electrifying about 8,500 vehicles, and that's for buses, port equipment, delivery trucks. So we're really looking to continue to engage the partners that helped us get here to implement the program in the best way.
Excellent. So Katie just mentioned a consultation with East Yard Community for Environmental Justice and others in the environmental justice and air quality community. I imagine that that's a relatively unusual kind of phenomenon for that kind of alliance or consultation to happen. And so I'm curious, Laura, if you could talk a little bit about that, about how you see the role of organizations like yours in working with the private sector and creating the kind of change that you want to create.
Definitely. I think historically we have had to fight for a seat at the table. When I say we, I mean East Yard communities and other community organizations. And oftentimes we are seen as very oppositional. But what's happening now is that what we needed to happen is happening because we knew we were right? That we needed zero emissions. We have some great allies and some great partners like Adrian and other folks who stand up alongside us. But that wasn't historically the case, right? But here we are now, right, where these opportunities are now coming up, right? Zero emissions is now something that everybody's talking about, not just something that we're talking about, right? And that we're all seeing that, starting to see that vision together. And so I think because we fought for so long to have a seat at the table, it's just natural for us to now get together, right? This benefits SCE, this benefits East Yard communities and the community stakeholders that are all around the South Bay and California. And so I think that's how that came to be. It's mutual interest. For us, it's about health. For us, it's about our livelihood. And for SCE, I think it definitely benefits them as well. And so I think it's just natural, and we appreciate not having to fight for that, right? We appreciate being able to have a space where we can just communicate, right, and figure out a solution rather than having to bargain for our health.
Thank you. So Veronica, I want to get you into this conversation a little bit. So some of the issues that have come up relate very specifically to the implementation of AB 617, which I'd welcome you talking a little bit about, and some of the synergies between greenhouse gas emission reduction and air quality reduction. And it seems like that synergy is part of what is creating this. This is one of the types of strategies that has a benefit on both sides. And so I'm curious how you see ARB's role in that and in this process generally.
It's interesting because I was hired by the Air Resources Board a little over a year ago, and part of the reason that my position was created, an executive level environmental justice position, was because the environmental justice community, which is really powerful here in California, put a lot of pressure on the agency and insisted that they needed executive level leadership. And a lot of those voices that created this position came out of AB 32 and opposition to cap and trade. Specifically, our Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, which was created under AB 32 to advise us on the implementation of the cap and trade program. And so along with that, when I stepped through the door, I saw my role as to guide the agency, among many other broad things, integrating environmental justice to all of our programs and things like that, strategic planning, to just kind of distill it to, I need to be working on reducing emissions in low-income communities and communities of color in California. So there were a couple of tools that were in place at the time that I walked through the door. One was AB 197, which requires the Air Resources Board to achieve direct emission reductions of greenhouse gases. And when I say direct emission reduction, I mean in contrast with cap and trade, where large facilities are able to buy allowances or permits in essence to emit greenhouse gases. So AB 197 was intended to make us, besides looking at cap and trade and market-based mechanisms, to actually achieve direct emission reductions. And to get to kind of what you were talking about, Sean, the interplay, there are some studies out there that have linked emission of greenhouse gases to the emission of co-pollutants, and the co-pollutants are what are most harmful to communities. So, in talking about zero emission, some of those co-pollutants are particulate matter, for example, that can cause respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, asthma. So because there have been these studies making this link, it became apparent not only to the environmental justice community, but to me and to our agency, that it was really important to, besides reducing greenhouse gases as a global pollutant, to really be thinking about what's happening locally in communities. That led to a year ago, or almost a year ago, when Governor Brown was had his initiative before, or his legislation before the legislature, to extend our cap and trade program from 2020, when it would sunset, to 2030. In order to get that passed, it was really important that we also, or that the governor also address and kind of double down on AB 197. So AB 617 was passed with the extension of cap and trade, and 617 requires a number of things. It requires the Air Resources Board to prioritize the most heavily burdened, most highly exposed communities in the state, to prioritize those and actually come up with a list of communities that were the highest priority for us to focus on, and lay a framework for the local air districts to be able to reduce emissions, both from stationary sources and mobile sources in those communities. So we're in the middle of putting together what that list looks like. What are the communities in the South Coast Basin that are the most overburdened and highly exposed? We haven't produced the list yet. We've heard from the Air District, and we have, from this Air District alone, I think they submitted maybe 50 or 60 potential communities, many of them in the freight corridor. So next September, we'll be going to our board with this list of communities statewide that are the most overburdened. We're going to go have a strategy, a statewide strategy, and as I said, kind of laying the blueprint for the air districts so that they are able to first fill gaps where there is no data or not enough data on air quality. Now, certainly there are areas of the region where there is a lot of data, especially when air districts like South Coast have programs that have been long going, like their MATES program that assesses toxics in disadvantaged communities. But anyway, the two main prongs of that law are air monitoring and actual strategic plans to reduce emissions in the most overburdened communities. And I think that AB 617 is particularly relevant here because as we talk about zero emission, AB 617 is a tool that can be used in concert with some of the other tools that we have, like our freight regulations and incentives and things like that, to engage communities and allow communities to give them the platform to create programs to reduce emissions in their communities.
Great, thank you. So I'm curious what you folks think, and I guess I'll focus this question mostly on Adrian. What sort of alternatives there are to battery electrification in the freight sector to get to zero emissions? I mean, we've heard today about the idea of not committing to or picking a strategy. We've heard about near zero versus zero emissions, but even within zero emissions, there are different types of strategies, including various types of fuel cell technology. I'm curious what you see, from your perspective in policy advocacy, what that looks like now.
I think one of the biggest directional forces we have in California, which some other states don't have is we do have SB 350, which talks about widespread transportation electrification. So our legislature has directed agencies, and it's written agencies, it's written pretty broadly, to focus on widespread transportation electrification. Now, there are other technologies out there, fuel cells and whatnot, but I think the amount of focus on electrification, particularly in the trucking sector, in the last half year, kind of signals that that is a good technology to push. And I know that the debate about near zero and zero is it's a robust debate. And I think one thing I want to just clarify is Earthjustice and our partners and clients like Laura and East Yards, we're just being clear. We're focusing on zero emissions. If we're in the PUC on a transportation electrification docket, someone comes in and says, we need to talk about near zero, we're going to say, no, this is an electrification docket. It's okay to have spaces where you can talk about zero emissions and really roll up our sleeves, because we acknowledge this is going to be hard. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And the other thing I want to just point out, for example, the last couple months at the Air District, they gave millions and millions of dollars for natural gas infrastructure. I wasn't there. I didn't come up and say that's a bad investment. There's a lot of near zero and other technology that's happening now, and we're not, Laura and I, we're not there. We're not talking about it. But, I think we see a lot of promise in electrification, and I think the legislature saw that too. And I think they also saw potential grid benefits, potential benefits for ratepayers. So, I think we still need to push the other technologies. I'm always a firm believer that, we need to push the vehicles and the utilities and everyone to get the best technology. And we are seeing some exciting developments with fuel cells, but I think we're going to see a lot of investment and a lot of rapid technology improvements with electric, and I think it's a good place to focus.
Thanks. Anyone else want to comment on that? Add to the question? Sure.
Yes, I actually wanted to jump in on this because I thought of the 710 project, which has been brought up here today, so I wanted to take the time to talk about it because I've heard a lot of folks talk about how important this corridor is, right? Does everybody know where the 710 freeway is at? Raise your hand. Let's see if you're awake. Yes, awesome. Okay, fantastic. So we all know where this corridor is at. We all know what's on it, right? I'm on it, right? And a few of y'all are on it, right? But there's a bunch of trucks on there, right? I think we realize that, I think for Easter, and I want to make this position very clear, we're not against business. We're not against truck drivers, right? A lot of these truck drivers are our neighbors and our cousins, right? But we want to make sure that this is healthy air for both our truck drivers and ourselves. And so getting back to the question of technology, we had, when I say we as community members and a few other groups like Earthjustice, Legal Aid Foundation, a couple, NRDC, and a couple other partners, created a model, a community-based model and plan, right, to get to zero emissions, to get to something that we're all here to achieve today, right? In that, we wanted a specific plan to look at different zero emissions technologies, right? So when we're talking about not taking a preference, that means we're not doing our math correctly. That means we're not planning for the future correctly if we're not looking at all the options and what those impacts will have on our communities. For example, we were looking at a catenary system, right? I don't know if Siemens is here at all, but I haven't seen them here, even though they have a 1 mile track on Alameda. I think it would have been great to have them here to demonstrate and talk a little bit more about that technology. So we definitely think that's a possibility. Yeah, it's a big investment, right? But aren't we about big investments? This is such a major corridor, right? Is this not worth an investment to look at, right? And we've asked for this to be studied multiple times, but agencies like Caltrans, like Metro, right, don't give us those opportunities, right? And so this is why we say we're excited and ready for opportunities like the ones with SCE, where we're able to have a seat and have the conversations as community members, as community leaders, as residents that will be impacted by this project, to talk about these different technologies. Let's get this education to our community members, and let's talk about what are those different options. Because a lot of us explain to me what fuel cell is, because we definitely need some education up on that, right? We would love to have more education on that. Right? And we're definitely getting that into our communities, but we also need to have a seat at the table, right? We also need our opinions valued, and I think that's where that balance lies for us.
Thank you. Katie, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just add that even for us as the electricity company, we're obviously, like I said, full bore on electrification and electric vehicles. When we look to 2030, though, we're not saying that 100% of medium and heavy-duty trucks on the road are going to be electric. It's more like around 8% of heavy-duty vehicles and 16% of medium-duty vehicles. So I think making the discussion into it's this or that is the wrong way to go. It's much more nuanced, and I think there's different people that are focused on what they think is best to clean the air in their communities, and for us, it's electric vehicles, but that doesn't mean that there's not other technologies that are out there.
Sure.
We're going to work on Edison to get those numbers and projections up, because
We'd love to.
but I think that's a good point. Even in our comment letters, we're not talking about overnight. We're talking about sustained focus on getting zero emissions. And I think in 2006, the ports adopted their first Clean Air Action Plan, and David Freeman and Geraldine Lopez Mendoza and Doug Kraus and all the other board members, they put it in, the Port of Long Beach board members too, put in a provision that said the ultimate goal is a zero-emission freight system, and will always be 20 years away, unless it's 20 years away. So unless we start now, we're always going to be 20 years away. And I think that's been something we've put in probably 50 comment letters, say, let's get going, let's get this done, let's figure, we understand it's hard. And I think that's the big point. It's not going to be immediate, but unless we take significant steps now, like getting these Freightliner and BYD and other trucks on the road in Southern California, we're not going to meet these important goals.
Sean, I'll just add that Mary Nichols this morning, my boss, briefly touched on the VW NOx mitigation, and last month our board voted to spend more than half of the $423 million that California is getting out of the NOx mitigation trust towards zero-emission freight. So there is, while it is incentive money, there is a movement, a recognition at the Air Resources Board that we need to invest in zero emission when it comes to freight.
Great. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I'm going to put you on the spot with another kind of question, Katie. Earlier today, there were questions about, well, zero emissions is zero emissions from the tailpipe, but what does that mean when we're talking about electricity, given that our electricity mix still includes a lot of fossil fuel sources? So I'm curious to hear more about how you see our future power sector energy mix and its relationship to this set of questions.
I think that's a really good conversation, especially if you're talking not just in California, but nationally. Electrification makes sense where the electricity that you're using is clean. That's going to be different from California to the southeastern part of the state to the state of Washington. But the comment that you made that we still rely on a lot of fossil fuels, I would question that. Like I said, for our portfolio, we already have 32% of eligible renewable resources for policy wonks. That means that it meets our renewable portfolio standard definition. But we also, in addition to that 32%, have a lot of rooftop solar in our area. We have large hydro that's emission-free. So what we see as critical to this electrification pathway is making the grid even cleaner. Like I mentioned, our goal is 80% carbon-free emissions by 2030. When you're doing that, every time that you're cleaning the electricity grid, you're getting a benefit from the vehicles that are coming on the road that are being used by electric. So if we weren't on that pathway and we were relying a lot on coal, I would agree with that kind of statement and framework, but that's not where we are in California today. So that's why electric vehicles make a lot of sense. The other thing I'll say that has been touched on a little bit, and not sure if how much it was touched on earlier today, is the grid benefit, quote unquote. What we're seeing in California, I'm sure a lot of folks in the room are aware of this, is that as we're adding more solar to the grid, it's being used during the day, and we're actually producing more electricity than people need to use. Electric vehicles, one of the reasons that we're focused on what we call away from home charging is when you're at work, you can charge, that's going to be during the day. So the idea is that you can have electric vehicles that are charging during the day when solar is being produced, and you're able to help with the duck curve issue that a lot of folks are aware of. So it's a really great benefit, not just from an emissions perspective, but also from a grid reliability perspective.
And on that point, what are the kinds of strategies that you see within, say, within the city of LA and LA County for developing specifically more of that away from home charging through businesses and institutions where people work? I'm curious, any of your thoughts on that to the extent you've been involved in it?
I'll start real quick, just because the project that I mentioned that was port number 1000, that is specifically in our light duty vehicle away from home charging program. We're going to be looking to expand that program significantly. We'll be doing a filing with the Public Utilities Commission in the next few months. And the idea is that you can put the chargers like at workplaces, for example, and then we can have programs where if we know that there's going to be an event during the morning time when we don't need people to charge as much, we can throttle down the chargers. We actually had our first event that we did this last week. And then that means once we throttle them back up to 100%, you're using more energy in that hour than you would have. So it's a really great way to help with that duck curve issue.
Well, I have a thought, and I do end up going to the ports semi-frequently, and so that's one, when you're talking about passenger vehicle chargers, the ports are a big employer, maybe upping the number of passenger vehicle chargers in their parking structures. I know it's a small issue, but we need our large institutions to lead by example. On the heavy duty side, so the trucks and larger equipments, I think the SCE proposal is a great start. I think the PG&E proposal for hundreds of millions for medium and heavy duty is a great start. But at the end of the day, when you look at the sites, it's projected around 800 or so sites. To do the kind of widespread transportation electrification we need, we're going to need a lot more sites. And I think places like ports, warehouses, these are excellent places to start electrifying and building places where you can draw charges in the middle of the day. So I think doing more of that. The other thing we need is we also have municipally owned utilities like LADWP, and they're working on vehicles and working with the ports. So continued support for all of our utilities to make this happen, I think, is going to be pretty important.
So I'll just say that on the light duty side, passenger cars, of course, there's a lot of money being poured into it. We have a mandate, CARB does, through SB 350 to break down low-income barriers to electric vehicle ownership. And to that end, we helped, supported the launch of a low-income EV car share program here in LA called Blue LA, also one in Sacramento. Obviously, through the part of the VW settlement, $800 million over the next 10 years will go into EV infrastructure. Somebody, though, and I can't remember who it was, who presented this morning, I thought touched on the more heavy-duty infrastructure and where the cost apportionment is for that. And I think that that's a really interesting question and something to pay attention to as we begin to electrify and see more electric vehicles, heavy-duty electric vehicles in the ports and the goods movement.
One point for those people who are actually doing freight operations is right now there is funding for the make-readies, things like that, I think there's a huge benefit to the folks who jump in early, because I think this cost apportionment issue, even though the PUC decision was very well thought out, it was clear that those issues were in the background. Is, why do ratepayers need to pay 100%? And, the idea is this initial tranche and maybe a couple more, that's the case, but that may not be the case always down the road. So I think folks who jump in early and figure this out are going, it's, between the infrastructure and then also the vehicles, there's more money. And I think one of the things we heard is there's generally not a multi-year investment plan. On the infrastructure side, it's a 5-year plan, but on the vehicle side, you don't see that. So, I think we're going to see folks see a competitive advantage to getting in early.
So I'd like to open it up for questions for our panelists. Can we get our roving mics going? I don't know who's, oh, there we are. We have a hand up here, and we can start there.
Hi, my name is Nasim. I'm a graduate student here at the Public Policy Department. So my question is for Katie Sloan. So I was reading the proposal that Southern California Edison put out for the CPUC, and the plan for the infrastructure was kind of general. It was to kind of qualify for it. It was mostly the kind of the physical characteristics of the site that people owned. And there didn't seem to be a real strategy behind where the infrastructure is laid out. So I was wondering if there is a broader strategy that Southern California Edison has for supporting trucking electrification infrastructure.
Yep, that's a good question. So the way that our program is set up is that we, as the utility, aren't deciding on our own unilaterally where the charging goes. We need to work with customers that actually want to purchase the vehicles and show that they're purchasing the vehicles in order to decide where the infrastructure goes. So it really is a collaboration with our customers. That said, now that we have the final decision, we know all of the various parameters of the program, including 40% funding for disadvantaged community areas, 25% for ports and fleets, a limit on how much we can do with forklifts. So we're developing that strategy, and what we're doing is we're reaching out and collaborating with key customers that we know are early adopters that Adrian was alluding to or saying it would be beneficial to be, to get a better understanding of making sure we know how big the impact is going to be on our grid, and then taking all of those things together in order to develop a strategy. But really, it'll be the customers that come in early, and then taking into consideration where they're located, are they in disadvantaged communities, and determining where to go from that way.
Thanks. Other?
Hi, I'm Kristen Torres, calling with the County of Los Angeles Chief Sustainability Office. And I wanted to come back to a point that Laura made regarding the relationship between ECRs and large institutions who are helping or hurting to move the ball. And you specifically called out Caltrans and Metro, but identified, and even Veronica identified the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. And I've noticed the relationship sort of changing and the types of partnerships and establishments changing. Could you talk through what you would like to see from those larger institutions and some examples maybe from partnerships with SCE and also from Adrian if you have insight on this? Because I think that's a really important policy tool, is how are we communicating and how are we establishing places where we can have constructive conversations to hear from institutions that are based in community that have policy expertise. And I think that's the important part, is that ECR was right about moving to zero, right? So let's establish places where we can have those conversations.
Thank you for asking that. I think a lot of just to give a little background on Easter, the way we work is on a consensus model with our membership. The way we take positions, so for example, the way we took a zero emissions position wasn't because we just said, we want the cleanest today. It was because we took that to membership, and we had many membership meetings. We have members all the way from LA, all the way down to Long Beach, and all along the corridor. And we realize that this is a difficult decision, right? So when we make a consensus decision, we agree that we're ready to put in the work. And we're hoping that other people will put in the work with us. And that's not always the case, right? SCE and Eastern weren't always sitting at the table together. Other organizations and ourselves, we've sat with the mayor of LA, right? Right now with the indirect source rules and pursuing that. That we will be pursuing that with AQMD and figuring a model for that. We haven't always been on the same page, right? But I think having those discussions and tough conversations where we are on opposite sides, that's how it gets done. I think, for example, throwing shade at Caltrans and Metro, for sure. But at the end of the day, if we're going to sit at that same table because we both want something, right? We both want something for the 710. At the end of the day, we're going to sit at the same table to figure out those solutions that will hopefully benefit the community members. And so I think when we're looking at building those partnerships, we need to realize that we are an open door and that we're willing to have those hard conversations. And I think it's as simple as that. I think as an organizer and as community members, we're down to talk it out. You know, if you're down to talk it out, then we're down. And if it's going to benefit the membership and the community members, then let's go for it. And if it's not, then we'll figure out a different way, right? Through other partnerships like USC or Earthjustice or whatever that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the good news is a lot of groups have been raising these issues for a long time, and we're past, I think, the point, you folks are crazy. That was like when we were going to government agencies and other folks, that was the initial. I think now there's like, oh, this is something that's happening and it's there. And so I think it's really about creating meaningful opportunities. So the PUC's model that Commissioner Peterman and Guzman Aceves talked about for the utilities is the Program Advisory Committee, which is they're going to really rely on that group to provide advice to the utilities on how to spend this these ratepayer funds. I think the other, just one point, and I often get this point a lot, and it's like, so I work with Laura and other groups, and sometimes I'm in conversations where they're not present, just saying, hey, we want zero emissions, and a lot of that discussion is, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, you know, and I think those types of discussions aren't as productive because it presumes that Laura didn't put the time in to get her community up to speed and really understand the issue, and also presumes that they don't understand the issues in the first place. They arguably understand the issues probably more than anyone in these rooms. And so I think you kind of got to get past this notion, if I explain it to folks, they'll see the light and they'll understand why I'm right in my position. And so those are just two things I would say, is just create venues. And then the other thing is it takes a lot of time. So, I mean, I think having opportunities to have robust discussions where it's two-way, not you get a half minute or 3 minutes, and then we get 2 hours to speak to you. Yeah, with no interpretation too. That's another point, yeah.
And could I add one point coming from the kind of corporate side, how something that's helpful, at least from SCE's perspective, is depending on how large your company is, you may have a policy group versus a finance group versus an implementation group. And so when you have the policy people talking to a lot of community organizers, but not having the internal translator translating to how would this make sense from a business perspective, from a strategy perspective, unless you have that translation happening, it's hard to bring the whole company around for that partnership. So I'd say if you're in a large organization looking to partner with our community allies, make sure that it's not just one silo of the company advocating for it, but that you bring everybody along and figure out how to get the corporation as a whole aligned, because that really becomes very powerful when your C-suite agrees that this is something that we should do.
I thought that was a really interesting set of responses to Kristen's question, because you could have given a policy ask for these, for these agencies, and instead you all focused on a process ask, which I think is interesting. That you all, it seems like as a consensus, you all think that the most important thing is to develop processes which are effective in pulling people in and building the terms on which to set policy, rather than coming in with a specific policy ask. Is that fair?
Yeah, I was just saying, I think that's accurate. I think when we walk in, we have so many issues that we're dealing with all the time, and if we walk in one issue at a time, that's not going to work, right? And the reality is, in my home, I'm not just dealing with truck traffic right next to a school. I'm dealing with the freeway right next to a school. I'm dealing with the rail yard right behind my school, right? And so I'm dealing with all these issues at the same time. I'm dealing with people not having a job, right? Or a quality job, right? All these issues at the same time. So we can't go in, I think, one policy at a time. And I think Katie made a great point. I appreciate that perspective, is that, and Adrian's, that folks think we don't know, right? But we do know. We know so much. And so when we end up sometimes talking to just the community relations person for that company or agency or whatever that looks like, we'll always end up asking questions that people can't answer, right? People can't answer them because they're related to the business aspect, to the jobs aspect, whatever that looks like. And I think to have the whole team there, to be able to process things together, is the only way the work's going to get pushed forward.
Sean, I would just add that as you talk about, processes and how processes work, one thing that I've learned through the implementation of AB 617 is that it's really important for the communities who have the most at risk to be involved in the design of that process. So we came out of the gate last fall with our 3 workshops that we're required to do under the statute, and we did them using our own formula, where we do a PowerPoint presentation. We're usually reading the presentation and we're talking to people and asking them to respond. And we did that for a few months, and it ended up being not particularly effective. And so in the last few months, we've had a lot of community tours that communities and community groups like ECRs have been very generous to take us out on. But these venues for smaller group discussions, to me, are the most productive, and those are the ones where the community groups are actually shaping the agenda and when and where the conversation takes place.
Thank you. So we had another question. Sanjana, there's someone right in front of you. Or do you want, sorry, if there's someone already, go ahead, you go, and then over here.
Thank you, panelists, for this good discussion. I'm with Rail Propulsion Systems, and we're working on a battery electric locomotive, which is an emerging technology that we strongly feel is going to be a success. But my question is, how much discussion has there been in your respective organizations about freight rail electrification? Because it's something I haven't heard talked about at all today. And around the world, outside of North America, electric freight trains are very common. Western Europe, they tend to be lighter weight than ours, but they're majority of freight rail in a lot of cases there. But in Russia, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which carries trains 10,000 tons, which is similar to long-haul trains coming out of the ports of LA Long Beach, it's 6,000 miles long. It's the longest railway in the world. It's 100% electric. And South Africa and Australia, you have 40,000 ton iron ore trains, the heaviest trains in the world. They're all electric, and they have been for decades. So the conventional overhead wire approach, there seems to be this strange cultural taboo in this country. We can never talk about electric freight trains.
I can start.
I want to add something real quick. Well, the Class 1 railroads, UP and BNSF, they've long opposed electrification. Some of the reasons are legitimate, like the high cost and operational impacts, but some of them I don't think are as legitimate, but at least we should have the discussion, and this is the place to do it here in Southern California.
I just want to start by saying, yes, definitely, that's another opportunity, right? When we're talking about different ways to electrify. I believe the Port of Long Beach was doing like a Pier B, like the on-road, the new Ondock rail, which is like a transitional mode into electrification, but not fully, something like that. But I think this is the place to have that conversation. This is the first time I hear about it. I think the interactions as community members that we've had are not good ones with the railroads in terms of any type of conversation or any type of dialogue. And I invite folks who are from the railroads to come and talk to me after so we can have a good dialogue. But that's just the way it has been for us. I think it has not been productive historically to talk about advancing technology or anything like that. We organized in the City of Commerce, which is where East Yard started, and we had the intermodal facilities, 2 big ones, and it's a mess for our residents. There's complaints still about dropping their loads onto the trucks at 2, 4 a.m. I have videos about it, and ain't nobody doing anything about it, right? We're having conversations about, just the noise pollution and the light pollution. But I think definitely if we could get that reduced, would be a huge improvement. I think we definitely should get a QMD and how to approve that technology up in this house. But
One thing I've noticed, and so we're starting to figure out the vehicle charging infrastructure for battery electric vehicles. The thing that's still a real challenge is these big infrastructure projects. How do we electrify rail? How do we electrify the 710? And I think there's something we've got to break through to make it happen. So, we go to regulatory agencies like the Air District or ARB, and then it's, but that's a Caltrans project, but it's like, the governor's your boss, it's all like, so we've got to figure out how do you get these multi-agency folks together? Because SCE put out a white paper 4 or 5 months ago saying, we would love to figure out the 710, but we don't know, it's very complicated. And so I think, the same ingenuity that forced people together on the Alameda corridor, I think we need to figure out what's that process to get large zero-emission projects. And rail is a key one, and Joe probably knows it. It's a pretty important one for attainment. Yeah, so, you've got pieces in place, and we just got to get everyone in place.
I think one of the biggest challenges for rail is that it's the place where state and local and regional government has the least leverage because of preemption, federal preemption over so much of what governs railways. So at the level of engines, you can do work, but at the level of telling railroads how to operate or trying to regulate their operations, it gets much more challenging.
Sean, I'll just add that, yes, thank you for mentioning federal preemption. We do have, ARB has a list of regs that we're phasing in and working on over the next several years, and one of them is non-exempted locomotives. So you'll see that on the horizon.
Excellent. We have another question. Right.
Hello. Thank you for here. I'm really happy there's some EJ groups in the policy panel. Thinking about all this, I think it was mentioned that electrifying our freight system and the port has a lot of benefits nationwide, but especially for the communities that are right around the port. I'm wondering if there have been discussions as the air is cleaned up and as the communities, the pollution burden is lifted, if there are conversations on how to keep those communities there. Because I've heard from other EJ groups that somebody comes and cleans up the site, and then suddenly everybody wants to live there. So the EJ communities that were there suffering for decades have to go somewhere else that's still polluted. So is that part of the plans that are being discussed right now?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. That's definitely another issue. So as East Yard has developed in the last few years, that's exactly what we've seen in many of our communities. It's just start along the corridor. And it's not just actually freight. I'll point to the lower LA River and how they're trying to improve that along the corridor, which if y'all don't know, the lower LA River runs along the 710, like on the side. And as plans are going on to improve that, just how it's super cute in the north end, they want to make it super cute down in the south end where we're at. And so the problem with that is that gentrification is happening. Right, these folks, right, our folks, my families, my friends, can't afford it, right? I'm seeing the rent go up tremendously without very many improvements already. Preparing for that, right? There is no rent control, right? This Costa Hawkins stuff and all that. So East Yard has found itself in a position where we cannot just address freight, right? We're not just addressing that. We're addressing gentrification now. We're addressing housing. Right, we're addressing proper produce, right? That's not getting to our families and our stores because we don't have food access, right? We don't have grocery stores that are nearby. So all of these issues combined are things that we're addressing that are all symbiotic, right? They're all connected. And I'll just get to a quick example of how we're trying to, one of the examples to address that is through the Lower LA River Collaborative, we worked on a community stability toolkit. That community stability toolkit is basically a list of recommendations of like, this is what community members really, really need in their community, because ultimately it's the city's decision to pass some ordinance on rent control or anything like that. And so it was part of that. It was that stabilization of community members that should continue to live there to make sure we have low income housing or affordable housing. And all we're seeing right now is market rate. Southgate just approved like this, like, I don't know how many units, like 70 units market rate, and that's a predominantly low-income community. People can't afford that. So the folks that live there, they're not going to live there no more. The apartments across the street from there aren't going to be able to afford that no more because their rent's going to go up, right? So that's just one example, but I think I'll give you an example of how folks push back is right now, that smaller plan for the lower LA River is going to go into a larger plan for the LA River master plan. The community stabilization toolkit may not be in that plan. If it's not in that plan, it's going to get lost. All the advocacy, all the member meetings where we have this discussion, where we came to a consensus about this, may get lost, right? Because we don't have a seat at that table, because we weren't invited to participate at that table, right? And so that's why community participation is so important in all aspects. And we definitely get pushed back on those aspects as well. But thanks for bringing that up.
Thanks.
Hi. I am actually with one of the neighborhood councils. I'm the sustainability chair over in San Pedro. And actually, I was late to this event because I was passing out to my stakeholders the meeting that's happening on AB 167 on June 13th. And they could possibly participate in that thing about the air monitoring and other aspects for disadvantaged communities. Nonetheless, I was wondering if, in regards to collaborating, there are many other people who are extremely aware of every aspect of these issues, and there are other people in the communities that really want to unify. The thing is with environmental justice is that everybody is working very hard, but there seems to be a little bit of fracturing. Is there any way do you have any ideas of how to create a unified communication, a way of bringing in all the different groups and agencies and unify them into one message, since everyone really honestly has many of the same goals in mind?
I think a lot of it is a capacity issue. I will say a lot of us are stretched really thin. At East Yard, capacity-wise, we're stretched really thin all the time. But we love it, right? We love what we do, so we continue to do our work. So I think that's one issue. I think a larger issue is getting everybody informed and engaged. I think we try to do our best, for example, with the 710, making sure we have folks who are interested in the issues, try to get them as involved as possible. Sometimes folks do fall through the cracks, and sometimes we just don't align on some issues. Even when, even though we're East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice, we don't use the environmental justice part all the time, because people use it all the time. And environmental justice is so broad and can mean so many things. Within environmental justice groups, the truth is we don't always see eye to eye, right? There are some groups that claim to be EJ, but support natural gas, which to us doesn't make sense, right? So I think that's a loaded question. I would say it just depends on the topic and the issue. I wish we could get together on everything. The reality is I haven't seen that happen in my short lifetime. Yeah, I don't know if other ideas to get.
I'll just say that every community is unique, and with AB 617 and each community that we talk to, I hear EJ groups saying, you know, I'm speaking my truth. I can't say what the truth of this other organization is, and I don't want to minimize it, but, you know, they speak their truth. And so I just want to kind of underscore that every community is different, and so that also could feed into it.
So we just have about 5 minutes left. So I think what I'd like is just for each of you very briefly to just say one thing about what you see the next move you're going to make on policy is, or the thing that you'd like, if you had a chance to tell the group here one thing either that you are focusing on next or that you'd like the group to focus on. We can just go through one by one, maybe starting with you, Katie.
All right. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but we will be looking to expand our Charge Ready for Light Duty Vehicle program significantly. We expect to be doing a filing in the next few weeks here. And so we would really love the folks that engaged on our medium and heavy duty program to engage on that one. And for us at this stage, it really is about taking the program that we have from the Public Utilities Commission and implementing it and doing that in the best way possible. So we want to continue our engagement with our allies like East Yard and Earthjustice to talk about what's the best way to spend that money in a responsible way, because it's our customers' money and it's our community's air.
Thank you. Veronica?
Well, as you can imagine, I continue with the implementation of AB 617. It's running a marathon until the end of September when we go to our board and hand the baton off to the Air District, so get ready, Joe. But being on this panel has been really, every time I have a conversation like this, and especially when I'm sitting on a panel next to an EJ group, I'm constantly like learning something or thinking differently. And so one of the things about AB 617 are these community emission reduction programs that are going to be happening. And the question about gentrification made me think, well, you know, if we really do have a steering committee for each community, which is what we're going to call for under AB 617, populated by people who live in the community, why can't we put anti-gentrification ideas into these community emission reduction programs? So I'm just kind of excited about continuing the process and learning and figuring out how we can come up with creative and non-traditional ways, non-conventional ways to think about addressing environmental justice issues.
Thanks.
Cool. So I think one thing that I'm hoping folks walk away with is the importance of community participation. It seems like a no-brainer, and I hope it's a no-brainer to folks, but a lot of times it's not. A lot of times we're the last ones to get called in. A lot of times, if we get called in at all, right? And the value that's placed on community members who live in the areas where folks are trying to develop is sometimes very, very disappointing. And so I think moving forward, we would like to see, needless to say, zero emissions only, right? But also real considerable community engagement. That doesn't mean having a workshop at 11 a.m., right? Like that means having interpretation. Thank you to interpreters in the back. That means having just robust 6 to 8 p.m., having food, having childcare. These things are meaningful. These things are what's going to change the way we all evolve together rather than us just fighting. That's what that's going to do. So I hope that folks walk away with that.
Thank you.
So I'm going to mention two things. One, I think the ports are trying to figure out a rate for the next generation of conversion of the drayage trucks. I think that's going to be a pretty important discussion point. One of the, I think, things that people realize is that rate that they did the first time was a very important driver of shifting that fleet, and probably one of the most successful and largest fleet conversions in U.S. history. So we're going to have another fleet conversion. And so we're going to be working to kind of identify how can you do a rate that will push zero emissions. So even if right now there might be only 100 trucks, what type of rate structure will help push more and give benefit for zero emissions? That's one thing. And then the second thing I'm excited about is Port of Long Beach's energy plan. I think that's an interesting concept. I hope, I think our friends at LA and DWP should consider some type of companion piece, because I think you need these venues to have open dialogue with community and environmentalists and businesses and other folks about how do we get to this electrified or zero emissions future.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists for that great discussion. And now I'm going to invite Ethan Elkind up here to close out our day. Ethan, some of you or many of you may know Ethan. He's really the person who has spearheaded this entire Bank of America initiative between UCLA and UC Berkeley Schools of Law. He's been working for about 10 years on various aspects of greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and has authored most of the reports that you'll find if you go on the website with the URL on the very back of your program. He's also a former UCLA law student, a student of ours. So I'll welcome Ethan to wrap up the program now, and I want to thank everybody for a terrific day.
All right, so I know I'm the only person standing between you and the reception, so I'm just going to take a short 90 to 100 minutes here to go through a quick summary of all the discussion points. But you're going to have to bear with me, because I won't tell you how to access the reception until the very end of this wrap-up. But I'll be pretty brief here. I just wanted to summarize just some of the key themes that we heard today, talk about some of the top solutions, and then I'll just talk quickly about next steps. And these are just my personal reflections. So I would actually welcome feedback from all of you as to what some of the key takeaways have been from today. And in terms of next steps, just briefly with the summary here, we will package this into a sort of a high-level document, as I mentioned in the very beginning, that we will then release publicly and also blog about as well. So just real quick, 3 themes that jumped out to me. The big one being the technology, uncertainty around the technology and where the trends are going. So that would include things like the cost and range of the batteries. Will they be improving enough? We heard that from Joe and also from Jimmy and Daniel as well from Tesla about different perspectives on where the technologies are and can we concede some of the limitations. Similarly on the charging technology, not just the batteries, and you heard Ryan Popple talk about that as well. Also questions around technology related to autonomous vehicles. I thought Vic had some interesting comments in particular, basically saying that this isn't something that we have to worry about in terms of job losses, at least right in the near term. And then, of course, the role of regulation that Adrian talked about in terms of forcing technological innovation. In other words, if it's going to take 20 years, as he said, why not begin now? Second theme, the context for deployment is really critical here. And we heard a lot today about the unique setting at the ports and how that is going to affect deployment. So certainly the location and type of infrastructure has to mesh with operations. We heard about from Renee and Chris and others about the unique needs of how these port and freight, good-moving technologies have to be able to sync up with the technology deployment. And of course, all the diversity of equipment at some of these spots here. We also heard the interesting context of the business structure of trucking. And we heard that from Michelle and Chris as well in terms of the small business nature of trucking. And then, of course, Ryan Popple talked about how at ports we've got mileage concerns to make these equipments pencil out, and issues even like parking density for charging. And then the final theme, the third theme that I picked out or sort of gleaned from this is the challenges of our policy goals. We want certainly the benefits to stay local, but we also are trying to influence global emissions reductions. And Mary Nichols talked a lot about that, what leverage we might have over a broad-based global changes, but really the lack of progress we've made in that to date. And then, of course, all the local deployment challenges and the need to continue our grant funding and the community policy engagement. In terms of top solutions, I kind of can list here 5 that jumped out at me. First is that we need more pilots and demonstration projects to bring down costs. Second, more financing and funding, associated grant funding, private market funding that we heard from Michelle and Brian, and utility funding, of course, utility investments as well. Third, targeted and improved infrastructure deployment for charging, hydrogen as well as electricity, and we heard a lot about the SB 350 investments from utilities, particularly from Jimmy and Adrian on that. And then Vincent mentioned a fourth solution, which is electricity rate reform. This really gets down to the nitty-gritty of trying to deploy electric charging infrastructure and having to deal with the electricity rate disincentives that sometimes happen. And then finally, the policy processes. So less on the substantive side, but more what we heard on this last panel of the different processes and encouraging cooperation among the different technology purveyors and advocates, as Joe Liu talked about, the prisoner's dilemma, but also bringing into community that Laura and Veronica mentioned as well. So as I mentioned, we'll be putting all that into a summary document, which we definitely want to share. We'd love to get your continued feedback on that. We also have the broadcast from today archived, so if living this in person once wasn't enough and you want to reclaim that magic or share it with your friends and colleagues, we'll have that link available for you. And of course, sign up for the newsletters from the Emmett Institute and CLE so that you can keep updated on all our various policy initiatives. So I'm going to give some final thank yous. First of all, to Daniel Melling and Nat Logar from UCLA Law, who were very helpful in putting this together. Of course, I want to thank all of the speakers for speaking today. I thought a really interesting, diverse array of perspectives and expertise. Of course, I want to thank Bank of America for being a very generous, consistent sponsor of events like these, and we hope to do more of that and keep you posted on that. And finally, I want to thank all of you for spending your day here with us today. And it's not over yet. The party is just beginning, and the doors behind me are the way to access. If I was really awesome and coordinated, they would just fling open right now magically, and but you're going to have to actually go ahead and push those open. But please do stick around. Enjoy yourselves. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you at future events. Thank you.